everybody. Welcome to our Parrot Stars Podcast. My name is Alexis Highland. I am the manager at Parrot Stars, and I am joined today by Ashley and Avery. They also work with me at Parrot Stars. And then we are featuring Lucky, my little blue-headed Pyonis, as our parrot guest for this episode. He is back there hanging out now. He munched on his breakfast and now he's relaxing, but he'll be with us for as long as he sees fit. He's a pretty independent little boy, so when he's ready to fly off and go back to his cage, he will. Okay, so if you're not aware, Parrot Stars is in Arlington Heights, Illinois. So we are near Chicago, which means we see all 4 seasons throughout the course of the year. So we have pretty significant weather changes throughout our year. But as like most Chicagoans do, we embrace the warm weather and we love being outside from anywhere 6 degrees or above. So we want to talk to you all today about summer safety with your companion parrot because there are a lot of advantages to taking parrots outside and exposing them to sunshine and the outdoors. They're just really stimulating and good for your bird's overall mental and physical health. So we're going to talk about how to take your parrot outside in a really safe and thoughtful manner to avoid some of the potential risks associated with taking your parrot outside. And again, this is our first season of our podcast, and there are a lot of conversations to be had. So this conversation today is just kind of meant to be how to get started with taking your parrot outside in the safest manner possible. We're going to acknowledge that there are other ways to take your parrot outside, but for the sake of today's conversation, we're kind of appealing to the average bird owner who may have a parrot that's either clipped or not clipped and wants to get the bird outside, but has to do it in a really safe and thoughtful way. So just here to give you some guidance on how to do so safely.
So last year, you did a really cool post on social media with Rascal, the scarlet macaw we have at Parrot Stars, and you brought her home and she was enjoying your sprinkler in your backyard. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes. So Rascal is our resident scarlet macaw, as Ashley mentioned, and she's about 6 years old and she is fully harness trained. So one of the options of how to take your parrot outside safely is in a harness, but it takes time to build towards that. It was not something that I achieved with Rascal overnight, but it is something she is trained to wear safely now. So that was Memorial Day weekend, and we are always closed on Mondays, but that Monday in particular, I was like, all right, I am not doing anything Parrot Stars related. Like, I am just going to enjoy this day. But technically it is still something Parrot Stars related because I went to the store and picked up Rascal and brought her home. So I live really close to the store. So it's actually kind of nice perk of in the summer weather that on my days off, I can take some of the parrots home and let them be outside in the backyard under supervision. So we don't really have a place at the store right now where we can have a lot of outdoor activity for the birds. We're working towards that. So for now, my backyard is the option to get them that natural sunlight. But yeah, it was an absolutely gorgeous day that day. The sun was shining. It was really, really warm. So I was giving all of my dogs a bath and Rascal was home with me. So I brought her outside when I was done giving the dogs a bath and put her on one of the patio chairs, grabbed the hose and started spraying her down with like the mist setting on the hose. And she literally sat there bathing for like 30 minutes. And then like every time that I turned the hose off, she like looked at me like, why did you stop? So I got some really great images and pictures and I posted it on social, but yeah, she really enjoyed it. So Rascal is one that she's a fairly good example. And if you guys don't mind me kind of hogging the mic here, I'll tell you a little bit about how I kind of got to the point where I can have her outside safely and in a really stress-free way. She's a 6-year-old bird. So when we started our harness training, and I think later on in the episode, we'll talk a little bit more about how to integrate the harness safely, but training her to wear the harness is its own thing. So it takes a long time and just getting her into the harness. So there's all this indoor work that has to happen before the outside stuff with the harness even occurs. But in the meantime, I was periodically taking her out into a carrier and letting her kind of just get used to coming in and out. So one thing that people need to consider when they're starting to think about the option of taking their bird outside is that for birds that haven't been outside ever, or maybe haven't been outside in a long time, the outdoors is like very, very stimulating. There is a lot of noise. There's a lot of light and a lot of movement happening all at one time. So for her, she's much better now, but she was kind of a nervous baby. Like she was always like very vigilant and never really seemed to have her guard down. So I periodically took her out in the carrier and I would take her into the car and everything so that she'd get used to like just the mechanism of going into a carrier, getting in the car, taking a ride. So she wasn't terrified of the experience the first time I wanted to take her out in the harness. And then once we got her fully harness trained and she was wearing it with confidence, we do little like laps around the store. And then we would slowly start doing laps around the block. And then we'd go to the park down the street and then we'd walk through the neighborhoods and like wave at neighbors as we went. So the experience of taking her home on Memorial Day and having her sit out with me on a patio chair and like spraying her with the hose where there's birds flying all around and my dogs are hanging out, like this is something that took me a long time to build towards, but I think it's a really good example of what the potentials are because I really hope and feel that she enjoyed that day and it was really rewarding for both her and I. So I think that's kind of like our goal for the conversation today is to help people get the confidence and the skills so that they can have really cool experiences like that with their own birds.
I think the bottom line is just about the harness or travel carrier itself. It's just always making sure you don't want to take any risks ever. So
Yes.
Every time Rascal was outside, even starting inside when, she was coming out, getting used to the harness, it was always on and secure, better safe than sorry with that sort of thing. All right. So never, it sounds a bit harsh, I think, but I think saying that no matter how much you have bonded with your bird, and I'm sure your bird does feel that bond, anything could happen because outside is scary, and your bird could fly away. And that's the last thing we want and not be able to get home. So I guess that's the whole theme of today is being safe outside with your bird. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think we have to be careful because I think this topic can be quite controversial.
Oh, yeah.
People are highly opinionated about outdoor safety and how exactly like what you said, how confident their bird is outside, whether they're clipped or not. So we want to kind of present to you all our stance on outdoor safety and our stance on free flight and our stance on whether or not your bird should be clipped or not clipped. But all three of those topics are really, really deserving of full and deep conversations. So today, again, we're just really trying to focus on the weather changing, people wanting to take their bird outside, and for us, the most feasible and safe way of doing that, or describing to our listeners the best way of doing that safely. So I think there's a lot of people that feel that whether their bird is clipped or not clipped, that maybe they've had a couple experiences of walking out the door with the parrot, not in a harness or carrier, and the bird did not fly away. And our goal is to try to really communicate that that is not enough of a reason to continue to do that behavior because, again, your parrot may love you to pieces and you guys might have an absolutely outstanding, phenomenal relationship. But the truth of it is that we as humans have no control over what happens once we walk outside that door. You can't control if there is a car that breaks and screeches, or if a hawk or owl fly overhead unexpectedly and spook the bird. You can't control that maybe something crashes or kids throw something. I mean, there's so many things that could spook your companion parrot. And when they might have that sensation to like jump off of you or to take off, it's not because they're not well trained. It's not because they don't love you. It is simply that they are prey animals and they're going to have a really intense instinct to escape a situation that startles them. And almost always their instinct when they're scared is to fly away from whatever they're sensing is scary or dangerous. So that's where we have to really advocate for outdoor safety, because there are so many instances of really wonderful companion humans losing their companion parrots, not because they don't care or love their bird. It's just that there are too many variables outside that are out of our control that might cause a parrot to fly unexpectedly. And unfortunately, guys, clipped or not clipped, if they get off of you and they get out up into a tree or out of eyesight or earshot of where you can see or hear them, it's really, really hard to get them back. So
I like that you mentioned whether they're clipped or not clipped. There's no judgment at Parrot Stars. All of our parrots are fully flighted. My parrot's fully flighted. I would encourage folks to think about keeping theirs flighted, but if your bird is clipped, that's totally fine too. Our recommendation is flight, but I would like to mention that even if your bird does have clipped wings, that does not necessarily mean that they are safe when you go outside. Unfortunately, I've heard from quite a few folks, they end up with this false sense of security because they see my bird's wings are clipped, so they're not going to fly away when we go outside. But there have been instances where a really strong gust of wind sends that bird on its way. So I would just encourage you that if you do trim or clip your parrot's wings, you still take extra precautions when bringing the bird outdoors, because a strong gust of wind can just send them on their way, even if they aren't fully flighted. So something to think about. Take every possible precaution, because as you mentioned, once they're up and away from us, it's so much harder to get them back safely. So just avoiding as many risks as possible, whether or not the bird is fully flighted.
Yeah. And I think the reason that we wanted to make sure we had this conversation and we talked about outdoor safety is because we're a store. So we're Googleable as a parrot place. So we get a lot of phone calls as soon as the weather changes for people whose birds have escaped, seeking advice and assistance. And just like you mentioned, obviously our stance is that we recommend fully that parrots are fully flighted and we do not clip the wings. That said, if you do clip, we're not going to berate you or judge you. That's going to be your decision ultimately. And again, that's a whole conversation that we can have. But we often get phone calls. So this isn't ungrounded, like we're just kind of saying things. We're having these conversations because we have customers that call and say that their birds are clipped, yet it still flew away. And I think the gust of wind is huge, but I think sometimes we also underestimate what a huge jolt of adrenaline will do for a companion parrot. All of a sudden, like what you might see as very controlled flight with clipped wings inside might hit an entirely new level when the bird goes outside. So if they are clipped, they might still get up and out of eyesight or earshot of you. And I think then people tend to panic even more because they weren't expecting it and they didn't know what steps to take to try to get the bird back. The other thing is when we're talking about clipped birds flying away is they only need a couple of those primary flight feathers to grow back in to sustain a fair amount of flight. So the other tricky thing that will sometimes happen is that people have their birds clipped and then feathers have started to molt and grow back in. And especially for some species where their flight feathers aren't as distinctly obvious because they're not as long, like so Amazons or African grays, those flight feathers don't stick out as far as they do like on cockatiels or macaws or conures. So they might have some new growth come in that they didn't realize was there. And then all of a sudden the bird is essentially fully flighted. Even though some of the feathers are still clipped, they only need a couple more to grow back in it for them to be able to fly away. So I think that's the really important part of thinking about the outdoor safety. Even if your bird is clipped, it's still a potential risk to take them out if they are not in a harness or an enclosed carrier.
I think, yeah, definitely. But I think now would be a good pivot to focus on what the positives of taking them outside would be, because it has seemed a little gloom and doom. And that's not our goal, but I think it is important to kind of share the lack for a better word, the negatives of what, to avoid. Before we kind of talk about all the things you can do to have a wonderful time with your bird outside. Yeah.
Totally.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, safety first, protect against all potential risks, like you mentioned, but there are numerous benefits to bringing the bird outdoors and just sharing the nice weather with them, including just that exposure to sunlight and what that does for their physical and mental health.
Oh, yeah.
So once we've checked all our boxes, and we're making sure our parrot is safe, going outdoors can be an amazing experience for them and even for the humans, like you described with Rascal. That was not just fun for her, but it was really fun for you to share that moment with her too.
They are tropical birds.
Yes.
So the sunlight is a huge factor of that.
Yeah. So we have our large breeding program in Florida. And at our breeding program, all of the cages are outdoor. And we kind of pride ourselves in the fact that our cages are really, really large. All of the parrots can fly within their cages. But I think one of the most incredible things when I go down to that breeding program is that the birds look absolutely incredible. Their feather quality is
beautiful,
hard to describe because we're so used to seeing birds that are kept indoor for a bulk part of the year that when you see birds that have exposure to natural sunlight 365 days of the year, their feather quality is absolutely outstanding. Their colors are really intense. Just the iridescence and the texture is really unbelievable. And that's for South American birds, powder birds, the Australian, African. They all really, really benefit from that sunlight. So it is crazy when you see such a stark difference when you see birds that are caged outdoor all year round. Obviously, we can't do that up here in Chicago because we have to compete with the cold weather, but it is really incredible to see them. So I think for me, I've seen the evidence that the sunlight does offer so many wonderful benefits to their feather quality. But yeah, I think the mental stimulation is really, really good for them too. And we do know, I mean, we don't need to get into the science of it, and I don't claim to be a scientist or a vet in that way, but just like for humans, like we know that getting that vitamin D and being outside is really beneficial for our physical and mental health, and parrots are incredibly intelligent animals. I think there are psychological benefits from being outside. I think it's really, really important for them to feel that sunshine, to feel the warmth, and to have the visual stimulation of being outside.
Yeah. And Florida weather can be much nicer than Illinois weather, at least most of the year around. Here in Illinois, we're always being mindful about at what temperature we can bring our birds out. So Avery, do you want to dive into that a little more about what temperatures are going to be safest for our birds? Or not too chilly at least?
Yeah, no problem. So the big difference, as everybody knows, from Florida to Chicago, but the minimum temperature, which might be a bit chilly, honestly, but that might be a personal opinion. But about the 60-degree mark. Anything above that, especially like in the 70s or 80s, when it's outside and it's gorgeous and sunny, is just wonderful weather for your companion bird to join you safely, which I think would be a great thing to do.
And I think kind of why we've come to that 60-degree mark at the store, and again, like you're saying, there might be different opinions out there, but the reason we talk about 60 degrees is because most people keep their house temperature anywhere from 68 to 75 degrees is pretty average.
Yeah.
So when you're going from your inside temperature to the outdoor temperature of 60 degrees or more, your parrot is not experiencing that huge difference.
Right.
And that huge difference is the thing that's risky for our companion parrots. So when we start getting into the 20s and 30s here, and your parrot's going from a really warm body temperature, even though they're warm-blooded and they hold their body temperature when they go outside, that sudden blast of air and that really fast drop is dangerous because they don't have the same mechanism that we do to kind of like shiver. And I mean, they can shiver, but they don't adjust to it. And then think about us too. I mean, when we're going out in those temperatures, we're like totally bundled up. If we were to just like walk out there bare bones from our indoor house temperature, out into that 20 to 3 mark, I mean, we'd really struggle there too. So kind of putting it in terms of like that significant drop, but so that 60-degree mark or more is going to really safeguard your parrot from those extremes. As far as like the opposite end, so when it gets too hot, keep in mind, they also, like for our Florida birds, they're acclimating over time to the changes in a day's temperature. So like they're able to kind of roost at night and kind of adjust to the slow decline overnight, and then they warm up with the sun throughout the day. But when we're again jumping from an air conditioned house now to like really, really warm temperatures outside, keep that in mind also. And then with the really hot temperatures, we do have to make sure they're still having access to shade and water.
Yeah, absolutely.
So even on that day that I had Rascal outside, like it was Memorial Day, so it wasn't like dead of summer where we're like boiling, but like in the sun, it was warm. So I had to make sure that like after she kind of got her bath, like I did have the option to give her shade on like the actual patio part of my backyard, because I also didn't want her to be like panting and get overheated either, which can happen. And again, in Florida, the way that our enclosures are set up is that they have shelter, and every single cage has a significant part of shade because we have a suspended roof system, but then they have the natural part, like the sun exposure on one side of their cage. They have the choice of being in the sunlight or going into the shade at any point during the day. So keep that in mind when you're going outside with your parrot, whether it's in a harness or in a cage. You should seek out places where you can put them in the shade so they're not just like sweltering in the heat either.
I think water always, no matter what temperature, really, should always be accessible.
Yeah, absolutely. I know at our summer festival, we like to roll our black palm cockatoo's aviary outside because, and it's an Australian species, he really enjoys that heat. And being in Illinois, it's not too humid. It's usually a drier heat at the time of year that we have summer festivals. So that also kind of mirrors what his natural habitat would be. And even still, we always position his aviary where it's partially under a tree and then the other part is exposed. So at any given time during that day, he can just sidestep right into the shade if he likes, or he can just bask in the sunlight. And so that way he does have access to both a cool shady spot as well as the nice warm sun. And then of course we're supervising him. So staff always check in, and then we're always making sure he's got fresh water. And something he really enjoys that we do usually like midday as it's getting warmer, we'll actually mist him down and give him a nice bath. So we're always monitoring his well-being, making sure he has access to cooling elements. Sometimes as a treat, we'll give him watermelon or other fruits that have a ton of moisture in it. But that's a way that, you know, even in our store setting, we can offer access like that to our parrots in a safe way.
Yeah. And I think you're highlighting a really great option for people. So obviously, depending on where your financial situation is, not everybody can afford to have like a permanent outdoor aviary. If you can, highly recommend. I think that would be awesome. Amazing. Yeah. Like that just offers your bird so much enrichment. But with that kind of aviary, when we're taking the palm out, he's still leaving the building and going to that aviary in a carrier. So keep that in mind also, because this is a conversation primarily about safety, that if you do have an outdoor cage or aviary, that is wonderful. And we love that idea and that concept. But the transport from the house to that aviary or that cage can also be really risky. So if the cage is small, our recommendation is going to be to put the bird inside the cage, inside the house or the garage before rolling it out. And then if it is an aviary, 100% recommend putting the bird inside an enclosed carrier inside the house and then walking them out to the aviary, putting the carrier inside the aviary, and then opening the carrier where there's no risk of potential escape. Because again, it's those unintentional fly-offs that can be really, really dangerous. And especially we've maybe done it successfully multiple times without issue. It's going to just take that one time of an accident happening. So just don't get a false sense of security when making that trip from the house to that cage or aviary. Make sure that the bird's still enclosed or safe.
Yeah, I think you brushed on it. But I think the thing that will pertain to a lot of people out there is simply just rolling the home cage or outside, especially if there's a get together or you're just hanging out in the evening or whenever. Just rolling the cage that the bird calls home from inside to outside. Make sure the food doors are secure and make sure that obviously the main door is secure.
Definitely.
But that's going to be an option that's just easy peasy. That's as safe as can be. That doesn't require you to actually handle the bird. If you want it to be a quick thing. So that's just a lot of things that you can do whenever. And then it'll be a lot of fun to do that too.
Absolutely. And something just to bear in mind too is even if it's not in a harness, if the bird's in a carrier or their actual cage outdoors, always supervise.
Yeah.
Don't want to run inside and do something or walk away. Even if the bird is secure in a carrier or a cage, just avoiding any potential risk that we have control over. So I would encourage folks to always supervise and not just feel like my bird's in a carrier or a cage, I can run inside and do something right now. Yeah. Always supervise, because there's always some variable that we may not think of or be able to plan for. So just make sure you're always keeping an eye on your bird and that they're safe. And if you do have a bird that, maybe they get a little nervous going outside, supervising them is going to help them not to escalate or get anxious, because they might feel safe because their companion human is with them. If we go inside, that could just give them an opportunity to get anxious, even if they're not accidentally getting out or flying away. We want it to be a really positive experience and minimize as much stress as possible for them.
Oh, yeah.
Totally. And I think taking in consideration bar spacing of your cage or your carrier is really important also. So I love the idea of rolling the permanent cage outside. Hopefully the permanent cage is at the appropriate bar spacing. But when we're talking about using a carrier, sometimes not the same amount of thought has gone into the carrier's bar spacing or the integrity of the carrier. So making sure, obviously, our long-term caging inside is typically well-made and the bird's not getting out regularly, but sometimes carriers can be of different materials, or they may be manufactured differently with less integrity. So for really destructive birds, keep in mind that anything plastic can be broken. So if it's any plastic carriers, they could potentially escape. That's another reason that you really want to make sure you're always supervising, so they're not destroying the cage or carrier while you're not watching and then potentially getting out. And then with the bar spacing, they really need to have appropriate bar spacing. God forbid we ever got spooked or startled. We wouldn't want them to get a head stuck through the bars, but then also you don't want any potential escapes to happen either. And I think for those of you that don't have the option of rolling the cage outside, and if your budget is a little bit tighter and you don't have that flexibility to invest in another cage, I highly recommend people kind of troll Facebook Marketplace or any kind of eBay for used cages. Obviously, with used cages, you're going to have to wash and disinfect fully. We're going to acknowledge that. And you want to make sure that it's in good condition. But you can find used cages typically really, really affordably that maybe you could store just outside all the time under some shade so it doesn't get rusted, or store it in a garage. And then just have that option of having that additional cage if it's not functional to roll the giant cage outside in the middle of the summer.
And I will say too, if you do have a cage that you're storing outdoors or is outdoors for most of the time, doesn't hurt to do a once-over before you put your bird in there. If we have wasps or bees or anything that could be a potential hazard to your bird, just do a quick once-over to make sure it's safe before you put them in there too.
Yeah, I kind of forgot about those type of things like wasps and stuff that could potentially, stress out your bird.
In Illinois, we get lots of wasps. And if you've ever had a basketball hoop or a swing set in your backyard, they always find a way to get into the hollow parts of it. So just being very mindful that you might have to look out for some opportunistic insects. But if you're just, again, checking those boxes and omitting any potential risk, your bird's going to love having that option to go to their outdoor cage too.
And then I really want to also acknowledge that predators are always around, even if you can't see them. I've had a negative experience seeing a free-flighted parrot get hurt by a predator. So for me, I am the most vigilant when I'm with my birds outdoor, and I'm so protective over them because they scream prey animal. Like everything about a parrot says eat me to a North American predatory bird. So a predatory bird in Illinois, but really all of North America, is going to see a parrot as an easy meal. It's just a huge red flag. And parrots are not native to North America, at least like up where we are. And most species are not native to most parts of North America. But the predators are quick and they're really, really hard for us to see or hear. And I think it's important to really remind people that there is a huge population of like hawks and falcons in our area. And they're camouflaged. Like we don't see them. And just because we don't see them, and maybe so every so often we see a Cooper's hawk or a red-tailed hawk sitting on a light post, I think people would be shocked to know how many there are just in neighborhoods hiding in plain sight. Like they're there. So even if you live in an area where you're like, I never see hawks in my backyards, well, it's maybe because you don't have like a rabbit's nest or something that's really attracting them. But they can see from really, really far distances, and they can get to you and your parrot really, really quickly. So always keep that in the back of your mind. You have to be careful. Obviously, the biggest risk with predators is going to be when your parrot's wearing the harness, because there's no barrier between the predator and the parrot. So if you have your parrot fully harness trained and you take it outside, just like Ashley mentioned, like 100% supervision the whole time. There should not be an instance where somebody's like kind of tying off the leash end and walking away. And the reason we're mentioning it is because we know it happens. Like we have people tell us these stories about how they take their parrots outside. And even though there is still, we have to acknowledge, like there would still be a small risk that a hawk or a falcon could come down and grab a bird off of you. It would be really, really unlikely because we're still going to be the bigger predator in that situation. And hawks and falcons don't regularly fly down to where humans are. I mean, they're going to still have a bigger fear of us. So if your parrot is directly next to you or on you and it's in its harness, really, really, really unlikely that they're going to get preyed upon. But the other piece of it is going to be when they're in their carrier or their cage. And I think people who have like backyard chickens kind of know this is something that's a risk also, that even if they're in a coop or they're in something like Cooper's hawks or red tails, like they'll still come down and sit on top of that cage or carrier or coop and still try to get the birds to come out so they can kind of pull them through the bars. And I don't want to sound all like scary, but we have to acknowledge that there is still a potential risk that the bird could get really severely injured or hurt or taken, even if it is still inside a cage or carrier. So you really have to be careful you're not walking away in those situations.
Yeah, I mean, we don't want to, scare people like you said, but it's so important to be mindful of the risks that can happen because that's how you're going to be safe with your bird. And you mentioned they literally scream prey animal, and they do. I mean, if we think about the way hawks, eagles, like those type of predatory birds look, they have the front-facing eyes. They can fly incredibly fast, very aerodynamic, and they blend in. And then we look at our parrots, and they are conspicuous. They are bright, colored. They're loud. When they're scared, they draw attention to themselves. So being mindful of these things helps us to protect them. And then in the same light, even if the bird is clipped, again, we don't want to walk inside or leave them unattended because they don't have a way to get away from that predator, or they might go into harm's way if they're startled. So being mindful of these things, again, intention is not to scare you, but if you're aware, you can be a lot safer with your bird and enjoy the outdoors in a way that doesn't really pose significant risk to their well-being. I've talked to folks that like to have that outdoor aviary, and usually our discussion will start to revolve around whether or not to keep that bird outdoors at nighttime. And my recommendation personally is to bring that bird indoors, because even if it's super secured and nothing can get in, that does not mean you're going to have predators that aren't circling that aviary at nighttime, whether it's like a raccoon or a fox, coyote, wolf, whatever it may be.
Totally.
Even if they can't get in, that predator circling around is going to create so much stress for that bird. And if they're not sleeping throughout the night or they're on high alert, high levels of cortisol, I mean, stress isn't excellent for anybody. The same goes for our parrots. So we want to make sure we're minimizing stress.
Yeah, I think you're bringing up a really, really good point. I think maybe our stance is like just they should not be left out overnight. I mean, it's just there. I think just rats, raccoons, I mean, they're just so smart. And I think sometimes they don't get the credit that they deserve for how savvy they are and how flexible their bodies are. I mean, they can get into really, really, really tight spaces. So totally agree. Nighttime safety is really important. Also, I would say just at dusk, time to come in.
Yeah. That's my stance too.
And when you hear about these things like the hawks and, the raccoons and stuff, it's easy to fall into the stance of like, that it sounds outlandish. It's easy to say that's not going to happen to me because I live in a neighborhood. But just like we already said, it could happen to anybody, anytime. You can't predict what's going to happen. Like we get phone calls at the store. I just got a phone call from a guest the other day that said that their bird was, I forget the age, it was like in the 30s. And a hawk just got it. And it was the saddest thing ever. So that's just the type of stuff we're warning you about, that it is still unlikely. All right. But it's still happens. It happens. All right. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think in the neighborhood, it's not always just the natural predators. Domesticated cats also huge problem.
Don't get me started about cats.
Avery is a cat owner, but
not my cat personally.
But
if my girlfriend's listening to this, I do love her cat. But for cats, are just killer animals, really, for songbirds, for your parrots that are outside.
It's so risky. I mean, dogs too. Dogs are still dangerous and they have their own part. But again, cats are like that next level prey drive where they will get, they will get to something they want, regardless if there is a barrier in between them.
And more so than the dogs, it's really common, or more common than dogs, for people to have their cats be like an indoor-outdoor cat. You don't really see indoor-outdoor dogs too much, at least where we live. So that is just, you're going to find more cats outdoors, incredibly agile animals. I mean, they have hops, they can climb, they've got long arms, and that's an animal that, like you said, their bodies are really flexible. They can kind of weasel into wherever. So I love cats too, but just things to be mindful of. They're very smart and agile, and more often an indoor-outdoor animal than our dogs would be.
Yeah, and like the hawks, they're always watching. Like you might not see them before it becomes a problem.
Because they're ambush predators.
So, I think it's really important to take all of those variables into consideration. And then one last little piece is, or a question that we often get at the store when people are starting to take their birds outside, is if they should be worried about like the avian flu or exposure to wild birds. And I think the same rule is applying. The way that we're going to recommend that you take the bird outside is in a secured harness or in an enclosed cage or carriers under supervision. So again, there shouldn't really be an instance where a wild bird, even a songbird that doesn't pose any dangerous risks from like landing on the cage or the carrier, it's very unlikely that they would if you're sitting next to the cage or the carrier or have the parrot on you. So there shouldn't be any risk of them transferring any bacteria or virus. And most bacteria and virus that songbirds carry aren't going to naturally like hop over to cetaceans as easily. So it's something that you want to be aware of. And ideally, you don't want your bird having direct contact with outdoor birds. And then obviously, we don't want to have a situation. And I think you kind of mentioned this too, like checking the cage or the carrier if it's stored outside. You don't want, if songbirds have pooped on it or gotten into the cage, you just want to make sure you're disinfecting it before the parrot uses it. But there shouldn't be any like intense risks of like taking your bird outside if you have a big songbird population in your backyard. Again, as long as you're being considerate of the fact that we don't want them like coming down and pooping or taking a bath in your bird's water bowl. I mean, just kind of being a conscientious person in that way is gonna be enough to keep your bird safe.
And kind of going off what you said, because you just reminded me of something. We talked about making sure our birds have access to fresh water when they're outdoors, being mindful that if it rains or that water dish is left outside, do not let them just drink from puddles or things like that, because even if they're not getting exposed to like the avian flu, there's plenty of bacteria or runoff from human products that could end up in puddles or pools like that. Just being mindful. Don't let them drink from a puddle. Give them a fresh water dish. Those sort of things.
And you're reminding me too, like, I know, like, again, I'm trying to really be mindful that like I'm a human and I make mistakes and I'm not claiming to be perfect in any way. Like, the temptation is so great when I have Rascal here to let her walk around in the backyard. Like, but I have dogs that like regularly poop back there. I have a huge songbird group that come down and they forage in the backyard all the time. So I think keeping them off the ground is also really important. I know the temptation is so great, and I think it is really wonderful like that they would be able to explore, but I think there is just far too much bacteria in the soil, in the grass, and just too much exposure to dangerous things. So
yeah, like ticks and things.
There's
wings.
so much stuff that just can potentially be harmful. So try not to let them forage on the ground when you take them outside either. And then if you are going to sit down with them outside, just put a blanket down. Like just
for sure.
Have that little bit of barrier. Don't let them dig around in the dirt or in the grass. To the
maybe
best
bring
of your
them
ability.
some foot toys too, so they don't chew on the grass.
Make your own little foraging board to take out there with you. That is our theme of the month, so we might want to mention the word foraging at least once during this episode. Okay, so I think we've talked a lot about our feelings about outdoor safety. We originally planned to talk a lot more about the harness aspect, and I think that almost deserves its own episode because harness training is so involved and can take a long time. But the one thing I do want to say is that if you are motivated about teaching your parrot to wear the harness, we're not sponsored by Aviator Harness and we don't have any like partnerships with them other than that we do carry their product and we use their product. I really like the Aviator Harness brand made by Parrot University. I think it works really well. They're very well made. They're functional. But the one thing that I have to advise our listeners on is that if you have not done harness training slowly and thoughtfully, you can really ruin your opportunity to have the parrot wear it confidently and securely. So it takes a long time to train a parrot to wear a harness where they are choosing to wear it and you're not just forcing them into it. And then once they're in it, they're wearing it comfortably and they're not just like, get this foreign object off of me immediately. So if you are going to harness train, stay tuned because we will have content to help you understand harness training. Aviator Harness, another perk to their company is that they offer great content about how to start your parrot on harness training. Just do not rush the process. And if you do use the harness and your bird is wearing it comfortably and you did the training the way you were supposed to, always double check the integrity of the harness before you go outside. Make sure they haven't chewed through it when you weren't watching. Make sure that it is the correct size, making sure that it fits their body and that it's secured correctly are going to really help limit any accidents if your bird is fully harness trained as well. Okay, I think this is a great conversation about outdoor safety and summer safety. We love the idea of parrots going outside. I know there are some controversial topics around parrots going outside and being fully flighted or clipped. I mean, there's so much content there. But our goal, again, was to just really reinforce the importance of being safe with your parrot outside. And again, we're only going to recommend wearing a safe and secure, well-made harness or taking your bird out in an enclosed carrier or cage.
Yeah.
So if any of our listeners ever have questions, you can feel free to reach out anytime. We're happy to assist in any way that we can. I think the best way for us to continue to help our listeners is to continue making educational content like these podcast episodes. And the best way for us to be able to keep doing that is if our listeners consistently like, comment, and share our podcasts. Also, rating and reviewing the podcast helps us a lot. So the more kind of feedback that we're getting, the more people that our podcast will reach. So we really appreciate our listeners kind of giving us feedback and rating and reviewing the podcast as well. And yeah, continue to listen as we continue to grind out these episodes. I think you're going to hopefully find that we're going to cover lots of different elements of bird care. So I'm excited.
I also hear your suggestions too for episode
Yeah,
topics.
definitely.
Totally.
We'd love to talk about stuff that maybe you guys are thinking about that we haven't addressed yet, but there's a lot to come.
Yeah, we're very open to suggestion for
Yeah.
sure.
And as always, be kind to your parrot and their parrot will be kind to you.
All right. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, everybody.